Good evening. Welcome everyone to the final lecture of the Ann B. Shepherd series on communications this semester. My name is Maru Walliser. I am a member of the Adult School Board. Can you all hear me? Can you see that fairly well with the lights on? Is that okay? Thank you. Okay. Before we begin, I want to remind you all that you have, I hope, been given a schedule for next semester's series, which we're very, very excited about on the Victorian era. And I wanted to tell you that the registration and information will be up on the Adult School website on December 31st. So before you go out to celebrate New Year's Eve, you might want to check that out first. Okay. And I hope you will all come back and join us again for that particular series. Anything else I should say, Mark? Okay, good. It's really my very great pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor Ann Nelson. I should confess up front that I found Ann appropriately, I think, on the web. And today was the first time I had met her in the flesh, and she has been with us here at the university all day. This afternoon, or at lunchtime, I should say, she gave a lecture to the European Cultural Studies and the German department programs on her book, The Red Orchestra, which I can only recommend to you because as I read it, I am so struck by the similarities between this story of the rise of Nazism and the resistance of a German intellectual and literary group to the Nazis. I am struck by the similarities I see so often in our own current history. So if you're looking for some good reading over the holidays, let me recommend to you The Red Orchestra by Ann Nelson. But that's not what she's here to talk with us about, so don't worry. You thought you'd come to the wrong lecture. But Ann is a remarkably diverse woman with so many interests, it's hard to catalog them all. You will remember at the beginning of this series, Tony Grafton spoke about the future of libraries and books and ended a little bit with the series of where we're going, the future of that particular media. Ann is going to talk with us this evening. She's had a great deal of interest in and research in and work in contemporary media. She's hard to classify, I have to tell you. She has been involved in as a foreign correspondent, a human rights observer. She's a playwright. Her play, The Guys, which focused on firefighters after 9/11 in New York, has been produced in 14 different countries and has even been made into film. She is a researcher, professor, an historian, as I said, and an author. She works in media development, very often internationally, in evaluation and analysis of the use of media, and that's why she's with us this evening. She teaches at Columbia a course called New Media in Development Communications. She consults for many leading U.S. foundations, including OSI, the Gates Foundation, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Knight. Formerly, she was the director of the international program at the Columbia School of Journalism and executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. She's written extensively on subjects in the media and also on human rights. She began as her career, as a war correspondent in Latin America and reported from Eastern Europe and Asia, and her work has appeared in a whole range of publications from the New York Times through Harper's, BBC, CBC, NPR, and PBS, which I hope is going to survive even after our lecture last week told us it was in big trouble. Her writing has won 6 awards, including the Livingston Award for International Reporting. Anne is a graduate of Yale, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the recipient of a 2005 Guggenheim Fellowship for work on media and Nazi Germany. So you can see that her range of experience is quite broad, and I know you're going to enjoy having her here and listening to her talk on new media and her topic, living online, and which we all have to do, I think. Anne Nelson.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Maru, and thanks to everybody for hosting me here at Princeton. I was just saying that the last time I remember being here was about 40 years ago, taking the campus tour. I ended up elsewhere, but it's just as beautiful as it was then. I was one of those kids which you see around campus, I'm sure to this day, from the small town in the Midwest, and I was the kind of nerdy kid that listened to classical music secretly when I was surrounded by country western. And sometime in the 1970s, National Public Radio burst upon the scene and changed my life. Around the same time, PBS launched its service, and we watched Elizabeth R. with Glenda Jackson. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember that. But I was astonished that I could be in this small town and have access to riches like this through the media. But part of me wondered why we didn't have more access to the good stuff. And in a way, that's been the quest of my career in looking at different societies and looking at the role that media plays. Why there's shortages of certain kinds of cultural materials and information, why you can have an excess of information, such as you have right now, and yet sometimes a shortage of wisdom and understanding to accompany it. So right now, I'm involved in teaching a course, as noted, called New Media and Development Communication, which is a research seminar at Columbia where we look at media and society, both here and in the developing world, and ask some really fundamental questions. It's an interdisciplinary seminar, which is incredibly important. I'm in the School of International and Public Affairs, which is already interdisciplinary, and I fight the good fight to break down the silos at our university to get people in from teachers' college, anthropology, visual arts, the law school, the business school, because the research is better when we all work together and use our disciplines to explore it. So tonight I'm just going to walk you through a few of the things that I've learned and have been studying in these recent years. Some of them are not fully cooked yet, because the disciplines that I see in academia have not, to my knowledge and to my belief, caught up with the tsunami of the changes that new media are wreaking on our society and our lives and our psychologies. So some of this is a challenge to people to join in further study of these issues. I'm starting with a slide of the digital native. In only a few decades ago, a computer was kept locked up in a university, a great big mainframe, and only certain privileged people were allowed near it. Now it has become part of our daily lives on so many levels. Young children have computers, and increasingly people have access to computer-like platforms through cell phones, even in very poor countries. These digital natives, as we call children who grow up with computers, are going to have their brains wired in a fundamentally different way than people who grew up with the written word and with broadcasting as the way that they approached information. Now, for those of us who are over 25, we could say that we're the digital immigrants. Many of us have computer devices in our lives, and they once told us it would lead to the paperless office. It didn't happen. Some of us, fewer and fewer, are what I call the analog elders, who have refused to make a transition. God bless them. So what's our goal here? I would like to posit that it's to be the media commuter. There are some things that each medium can do well. There are many things that they cannot do well. And it is our role as parents, as educators, and as individuals to sort through and have a firm sense of our goals and our tasks, and use media judiciously, because if we don't use it with discrimination, it can actually do harm. I want to talk a little bit about how new media or digital media is affecting three areas of our lives: our brains, our relationships, and our society. To do this, I go back to Marshall McLuhan. Now, the problem with Marshall McLuhan is that he didn't write very well about his own ideas. I don't know how many people have tried to read a book written by Marshall McLuhan, but it's almost impossible. And a lot of times, the best way his ideas are articulated were in his television interviews. At the end of his life, he started to put together what he called the tetrad, or the 4 laws of media. And I find that these are incredibly useful in understanding the changes media is wreaking on society. He said that each new technological development has 4 levels of impact. The first is that it enhances a human action. The second is that it retrieves something from the past that had fallen somewhat into disuse. It makes something obsolescent, something that we had used less necessary. And if you use it without discrimination and not in a judicious way, it can reverse its purpose. So let's look at an example with the cell phone. What does it enhance? It enhances conversation. It's easier to have conversations if you have cell phones. It retrieves the old practice of yelling across the yard. What does it make obsolete? Telephone booths. Anybody seen a telephone booth lately? Right? And it's starting to make landlines obsolete. You have many countries where people go straight to cell phones and never even install landlines in their homes. What happens if you have too much of it? It becomes a leash. You never hear silence. You never can take a walk without interruption. You can't have a conversation without feeling like you have to respond to this thing that is giving you orders. So in the same way that a car is supposed to help you be transported and enhances the act of walking or moving, too many cars gives you gridlock. So the same thing can happen in communications functions, where too much of communications devices or too much information creates a kind of mental gridlock or physical gridlock, where too much means less. Tom, not right now. He's writing FCC policy. Let's talk a little bit about how we comprehend information as it comes in. Some of the neuroscience that we're starting to see suggests that new media or digital media is a special stimulus to the prefrontal cortex, or the short-term memory. So in other words, digital media deals with our brain as though it's the screen, the information you get immediately. You might have had the experience of surfing the internet and looking at 20 or 30 different websites, and the next day not remembering any of them. Or another possibility is you say, oh, here's a factoid. And they say, where did you see that? And you say, on the internet. And they say, that's not a source. Where on the internet? And if you can't remember whether it was the New York Times website or something scurrilous, you're in trouble. You still remember the reference, but you don't remember where you saw it. So there is a way in which the digital media does not appear to be transformed into the filing cabinet of the brain, locked into the longer-term memory, in the same way that certain other media experiences might be. Now, sometimes people can read a novel and have an emotional experience with the characters of a novel. They follow them through a plot or a narrative. They feel emotions as they interact with these characters in a novel, or perhaps a movie, or perhaps an opera. Why would one kind of media experience last longer or make more of an impression than another? Well, one reason some scientists believe is because a lot of these deeper memories are stored in the hippocampus area of the brain, which is a question of integrated learning, which is physically very close to the amygdala, which is related to empathy and emotion. So if you learn something accompanied by a strong emotion, you're more likely to remember it. So for example, if someone says, the stove is hot, and you hear it, you go, yes. If you touch it and experience a strong shock or emotion or pain, you're going to remember it longer, right? That's one form of learning. Anything that involves strong emotion or a form of empathy or human interaction is going to be registered more deeply in your understanding. Now, for whatever reason, the internet in its current phase does not seem to be very good at instilling strong emotion, for example. So you have many facts and bits of information that float across your consciousness that may not be fully registered. Can this change with the technology? We don't know yet. But you will see that in a lot of cases, we have a society that has gravitated towards certain forms of multiple choice learning or teaching to test, which may mean that certain bits of information are temporarily registered, but they may not have a long-term meaning, contextualization, or emotional meaning. So for example, here's a project that was developed at Harvard. And the idea is that you will learn vocabulary by taking this multiple choice test, and you will perform for the reward of donating 10 grains of rice to hungry people in the world for each word that you learn. Okay, noble goal, that's fine. I've had students over 4 years go through tests like this. I've gone through it myself, and have found that while you can repeat the test and do better and better with it, the retention of the vocabulary words the next day is almost nil. Because, why? Well, anybody remember the Reader's Digest Ways to Improve Your Word Power? What did they do? They gave you etymology, the history of the word. They used the word in a sentence, right? So you had contextualization. So at least you had a fighting chance of remembering that word the day after you studied that page. Now, if you studied that word in the context of a book or a novel or something that gave you some kind of emotional reaction, your chances of remembering that vocabulary word are even better. Here, what you have is this multiple choice click test, and this form of online learning, to my mind and from my experience, is not very effective. Could it be? I don't know. What I have noticed is that of the forms of online learning that I've experimented with and looked at, the real success story is typing, okay? When I was in junior high school, I took a typing class, took it in summer school, had a teacher, had a typewriter, had a class. My kids learned typing online with a program. That's better. They learned it faster, more accurately, and in terms of rote repetition, the computerized learning program and platform was superior. Now, I teach writing. I haven't figured out how to teach writing with an online application. I haven't figured out how to have the student interaction and the class interaction that I have in a classroom and replicate it at an equal value online. We'll see. Something else that is of critical importance to our society is the question of how we absorb text. One of the ways this is measured is through something called eye tracking. And what the scientists do is that they have this pair of goggles, and they put them on people, and it measures the movement of the eye as they move across an object. Now, here's an example of a page of text. This is Swedish, so don't worry if you can't read it. And this is from somebody reading it on a printed page. The characteristics you see here is that the eye moves pretty much all the way across the page. You have fragments of words and short words to the right, and the left both, where they're not fully read. But you have a pretty good chance of comprehension with an eye tracking pattern like this. What happens when you look at a computer with a backlit screen? Jakob Nielsen is a researcher who does research on computer design for corporations and advertisers. And what he has found is the F shape, where the pattern is pretty much established, that the eye on the computer screen goes fairly far across the top of the first line, dips to the left-hand column, a little bit across the middle, and then skirts the left-hand column down the side of the page. So here are 3 different eye tracking studies on the computer screen. What does this tell us? Well, if I had written the text on the left, I'd be concerned, right? Because you see that the eye doesn't even perceive much of the text to the right side of the page. And it perceives it only dimly on the other 2 examples. So if you're going to talk about the comparison, the printed page would have the eye going back and forth in a zigzag, and the online reading with the backlit screen would be much more cursory. Well, what does Jakob Nielsen say? Number 1, users won't read your text thoroughly. Number 2, they'll probably read more of the first paragraph than the second. And users will read the 3rd word on a line much less often than the first 2 words. For us writers, this is bad news. So, in other words, what people are reading on a book, on a screen, is not the same thing. They're not having the same experience. And it's very interesting to me because the course I teach at Columbia is self-selecting students, average age 25, 26, who want to study new media. They're there because they like new media. The assignments I give them every year is to take an article, say from the New Yorker, and read it first online and first in the magazine and compare the experience. That's all I tell them. And I get pretty stunned reactions. They can choose the article, so it could be something they're interested in. It can be a sports story, it could be anything. And they generally tend to say, and I'm talking about a kind of a 90% sample, that they are not able to finish the online version of the article. And that if they do try to finish it, they get distracted by the online environment, their attention wanders, they don't enjoy it, and they can read the very same article on the page and say, this is brilliant, this is a wonderful piece, it's terrific writing. So one thing that we all have to deal with as an intellectual community is the idea that everyone's in denial about reading on the screen. And most of the students I work with say that if there's something that is long and complicated that they really need to learn, they print it out. Not only that, they need a physical interaction with the text. What does that mean? It means that they integrate their sensory response to the text by a physical interaction with it. So it's a multi-sensory approach. On the screen, your eyes are tracking. If you're turning a page, you have a physical action, you hear the page turning. Some people even talk about the smell of a book, of a beloved book. And all of that translates to a deeper integration of the information. So I can't at this point give you hard science about how all of this works. But I can say that after 4 years of focus group samples with my graduate students, it's a pretty unanimous conclusion. One of the conclusions that we have to draw from that is that if people are indeed printing information off the screen at this rate, what they're doing is taking revenues away from writers and publishers who produce books, and they're giving these revenues to people who produce ink cartridges, which are quite expensive, and the revenue of which rarely reaches the author. So all right, fine, but let's not be in denial about it, and let's deal with the implications of these actions. Another area in which digital media affects our lives is through multitasking and the division of our attention. And in some ways, this environment has been created almost as though this were the goal, which puzzles me. If you look at the page of the New York Times online, what you see is not just clutter, it's cacophony. You see many of these colored areas which are hyperlinks. And that means that every time you get to a colored hyperlink, the impulse is to click through. You can't read any single piece in any kind of continuity on this web page, and you are infinitely distractible. If you scroll down, you get video, and you get more and more loaded onto a page where, in order to understand these complex stories, you need some level of concentration. So here is this web environment that's designed as though the purpose were to distract you from the content of the page. This happens naturally in this environment. I'm just going to see, do you know if I can dim these lights here on the board? Yeah. It might help you to see the screen better. Okay, this is a page from Wikipedia. And this tells you something about how hyperlinking works. Everything that's in black is a regular page. Everything in blue is a link. And if you click on it, it takes you to another page. I chose at random an article about Pearl Harbor, okay? Now, one of my questions about the design of this environment and its utility is the randomness of these hyperlinks. So as you go through this article about Pearl Harbor, trying to understand why this event happened, you get to hyperlinks for words like Netherlands, okay? The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and it was when there was a war going on against Britain and Netherlands. Click on Netherlands, a country in Europe that grows tulips. Okay. And what happens in real life with a lot of people is they say, tulips, and they click through tulips, and they get to a family of bulbs that grow. So I have a saying with my students. I've noticed that with males, all roads lead to sports scores, and with females, all roads lead to shoe marketing. And you can just keep clicking and clicking, and finally you say, how did I get here? And where did I start? What was I looking for? So is this a question of the nature of the online environment, or is this poor design that has evolved haphazardly and will be fixed by the collective wisdom of our culture? I don't know. But in the meantime, you have users who are in these environments who are having a difficult time functioning effectively. So you have this environment that is set up and conducive to distraction. And young people who are in the process of learning difficult tasks, algebra, for example, and young people whose brains are still in development and are being wired, are especially susceptible to the influence of this environment. They're having to learn the powers of concentration. And instead, they're getting put into an online environment that is a constant barrage of distraction. Now, one of the people who's studied this, whose work is extremely interesting, is Gary Small, a doctor at UCLA. And he's published a book called iBrain that is quite interesting. He talks about the existence of brain fog. And he says it's the nature of the psychological response to spending a lot of time online and losing a sense of focus and concentration, and having not only a reduced attention span, which happens quite often both in young people and older people, but also a state that he calls continuous partial attention. And you can tell that when people have a number of screens open on their computer at the same time, they're not fully concentrating on any of them. And if you are unlucky enough to get a phone call at that point, you can find yourself saying things that are nonsensical on the telephone, right? Because you're trying to read, write, and speak at the same time, and the human brain is not, at this point, wired for that many simultaneous activities. So here we are in an environment that's almost demanding us to multitask at a level that we're not fully capable of doing it. However, it is also found by Gary Small and others that the online environment can be very helpful for senior citizens who need stimulation of the prefrontal cortex, and it can actually reduce depression and improve cognitive brain functions. So it's not as though you can look at the online environment and say good or evil or keep this, throw that away. It's this question of constantly trying to find criteria for use. New media and social behavior. I can't take a shower because my BlackBerry would get wet. One of our problems as a society is this idea not only that a cell phone becomes a leash to connect us to other people, but that they can take a kind of command over us where we lose certain powers of individual choice. And this can have a profound effect on our interactions with other people, certainly between generations. The uses of media between the young people compared to older people can lead to real tensions in terms of communications. It can promote addictive behavior where people just can't turn the thing off. In many households, somebody will be at a computer, dinner's on the table, just a minute. How long is a minute? A minute is very, very long. And you find all kinds of ways in which people's sense of time and social interaction are distorted by the usage of devices where they're not fully in control. And you can find that this will limit interpersonal interactions and social skills. So, for example, if you have two human beings who have agreed to meet at a certain place for a conversation, and one of them is on a phone call answering a random call from someone that they don't even know, right? You have a kind of violation of a social contract that has been in existence for a long time, and an inherent loss of civility. The other thing is that the anonymity of online existence can in itself be conducive to antisocial behavior, which is called flaming. And we're not entirely sure why this is, but there is evidence that this goes on, which I'll introduce in a minute. On the other hand, there is absolutely evidence of positive social impact. Families that are separated by distance can communicate by Skype. Communities that are dispersed can come together through online connections. And people who are housebound and handicapped have a way of opening up the world to them in ways that they never could before. I'm going to talk for a minute about an alternative reality site called Second Life, which has been bandied about as a way of connecting people. The idea is that you go onto this site and you create an avatar, which is supposed to represent yourself. In this case, you see this avatar standing in front of a building. Many universities have built lecture halls on Second Life because they feel that these avatars can come and hear lectures about Swedish history and astrophysics. That's not how most people on Second Life spend their time. There's a lot of activity on Second Life that involves fantasy interactions in activities that people would not necessarily feel comfortable indulging in their other lives. And in some cases it's silly, in some cases it's shopping. You take your real US dollars and you buy Linden dollars that you then spend in the Second Life economy, and you can buy clothes for your avatar, you can build a house for your avatar, you can buy land or islands for your avatar, which can cost you a lot of actual money to create your virtual life online. And the other issue for me, and I'll admit that I'm a parent of two children, is that there are some really horrific areas of Second Life where forms of sadomasochism are practiced that I won't describe. But the idea is that anyone who can figure out the program can get into these spaces and participate, and that includes 12-year-olds. And it's an area that concerns me a lot because I think that being exposed and being active in sexually exploitative, sadomasochistic settings is damaging to people, especially young people. Second Life, 18 million users registered, 800,000 online at a time. In 2009, the economy grew 65% to $567 million, real dollars. meaning its economy ranks ahead of the GDP of actual countries, such as the Gambia, the Seychelles, the Maldives. So this thing is huge. And again, this is something in which real people spend real money for a virtual existence. Twitter. How many of you are on Twitter? Not many. I thought it was silly when I heard about it, and I got talked into trying it out last year. And what I quickly found was that if I chose good people to follow who were involved in my field, I could get links to articles that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, and it has been incredibly useful. And if you could read this in better definition, you'd see that there's a PBS feed that talks about new media from PBS's point of view. Different universities and researchers publish all kinds of useful links. People say, oh, well, how can you get anything constructive into that few characters? The idea is that you post shortened links, which are usually links to articles in actual newspapers, books, or other publications. So it's actually just a kind of headline service that points you to print media. So it's kind of the equivalent of putting together your own magazine with your own selected masthead, which, depending on what you're working on, can be useful. Now, often, if it's done in a random way, you get negative results. And so this is going to the trending worldwide feeds, which, again, have a lot of profanity, have a lot of waste of time. And if you go into these sites at random, you will probably get some fairly negative results. Flaming, which is attacking other people online, usually from an anonymous standpoint. I went to YouTube and entered what I felt was a fairly neutral search term, civil rights movement, okay? The first comment to come up on YouTube was about how Black Americans wasted their time with nonviolent crap. They should have raised arms. And the response under that, the second comment on the YouTube search was racist, redneck, etc. We're getting charged, and jackasses. And then beneath all of the obscenity, you have the fourth grader that says, is there any way I can download this video? I need it for my civil rights movement project. Okay? But he has to wade through all of this garbage and all of this hate speech to get to have a space where he can ask a legitimate question about a video. And again, this is YouTube and the search term civil rights movement. If you look at the feeds for the YouTube, you will quite often find that fairly innocuous postings will create a response that involves hate speech, violent speech, quite objectionable antisocial behavior, but there's no consequence. The worst thing that can happen in retaliation for this is usually that it will get taken down, and that's not even very frequent. So in other words, we have created a social space where people can go into this space and interact with each other in a way that is not just rude, it's also offensive and an almost violent use of language. And where that's permissible and in some ways encouraged. It is the social norm in this space. And we have this space being populated by many people and many young people in an ever-growing rate. That's something that should be thought about. And you have a lot of actions of sabotage. When you go into that article in Wikipedia that I just showed you about Pearl Harbor, when I went into it preparing this talk, I found it was locked down, which meant that outsiders could not go in and re-edit it or add information because it had been subjected to sabotage. So within the wiki community of editors, it means that somebody went in and edited and added hate speech or some other form of very negative content. So one of the things that we have in this, is that Tom again? Yeah, he's very busy. One of the interesting aspects of Wikipedia is that when I ask my students if they use it, every hand goes up without question. When I ask how many contribute to it, I would say that it goes down to approximately 3%. And this is one of the great illusions of the online world, which is that it has this reputation and in some ways this publicity of being transparent, of being totally democratic. But what you actually have is a relatively small, self-selected community or population of people who alter and create this space and give everyone else the illusion that it's fully democratic and all-inclusive. This is not saying anything against the people who edit Wikipedia. It's saying that a lot of other people are lazy in thinking about what it is. And a lot of times they'll say, oh, the Encyclopedia Britannica is a problem because it's elitist and it's closed and it's not inclusive. What I try to tell my students is that every media system is not inclusive. Everyone is absolutely selective in some way or another. The question is whether it's transparent in letting people really become aware of the criteria for selection and participation. One of the utopians, so-called, of the internet is Yochai Benkler. He's a professor at the Berkman Center at Harvard. And he is someone who has argued forcefully that Wikipedia and the online information system has made institutions such as the New York Times obsolete. And that if you have enough citizens entering data into a system, you no longer need the institutions for knowledge creation of the past. He says that Web 2.0, or the interactive internet, creates unprecedented communities of knowledge. And he does admit that it often benefits from filtering or some form of editorial function. So even Wikipedia, which is one of the more open platforms, does have editorial systems where not just anything can be posted, it can be locked down, and it can be filtered through the people who participate. You have a lot going on with children these days who are wired really from the cradle. It's affecting childhood in our society in very dramatic ways. These days, many American children have a life that is indoors, sedentary, and they interact with devices instead of each other. One groundbreaking study on this subject was presented by the Kaiser Family Foundation. Just want you to absorb these figures. 8 to 18-year-olds in the US average 7 hours and 38 minutes on electronic media a day. Okay? Now let's assume that they sleep 8 hours. Let's assume they're in school 6 hours. Let's assume they go back and forth from home to school. By the time you add in the electronic media, there's basically nothing left. There's not playing outside. There's not playing with each other. There's not helping with chores. They have become wired, and these devices have become their disposable time. A lot of it's driven by cell phones and iPods. Less than a third say there are any rules at home at all. Heavy media users tend to get lower grades. This goes for adults as well, and this is a very plaintive posting from someone whose wife is suffering from internet addiction, and he's saying that she's so tied to her online life and activities that she's neglecting her children, she's neglecting the husband, everything's falling apart. And because the internet has become such a necessary part of everyday life, the family doesn't know how to free themselves of this influence and don't know how to affect each other's behavior. And so in a true American way, what you do is create an internet addiction recovery program, kind of a Betty Ford system for the internet. This is in the Pacific Northwest in the state of Washington, and these people have decided that the best cure for internet addiction is to go cold turkey and to play with baby goats. So the baby goat therapy is there in the middle. And in China and in Korea, the governments have actually decided that internet addiction should be described as a clinical issue. It is medically designated as a clinical problem, and they do have recovery systems. Their problems there are more with adolescent males who get addicted to gaming parlors and basically just don't leave, and their lives and their school lives fall apart. Now, one thing that I think is good to remember is that a lot of our internet environment is created in order to be addictive. And in some ways, in terms of our attention spans, it's the equivalent of nicotine in the past. What they try to do is to get you to stay on longer. When you're designing sites, the term is to make it sticky, right? So you want the eyeballs to stay on the site longer. And it is commercially driven, and the idea is that the longer you stay on the site, the more revenues will result, either through advertising or through the direct purchase of products online. That is the American market system and how this was designed and created. So it's not an accident. But then you have a question of the impact on the broader society. Sergey Brin, who was actually born in Russia and was one of the founders of Google, told students at Berkeley that technology is an inherent democratizer. So the idea is that more information is always more democratic. Now, that idea is not universally accepted. And one of the thinkers that, if you're interested, that you should look into is Yevgeny Morozov, who is from Belarus, and he publishes on the topic frequently in the Financial Times and The Economist. And he looks a lot at the role of online media and dictatorship. And he points out that Facebook and Twitter give Iran's secret services platforms for gathering intelligence about dissent. And says, once regimes use torture to get this kind of data, now it's freely available on Facebook. And that actually has been the case. There have been all kinds of protests ranging from Iran to Burma to Egypt, where the government has gone online and mined YouTube and Facebook data in order to identify and arrest dissenters. However, it can work positively as well. There was a graduate student from Berkeley who was writing about the unrest in Egypt, the demonstrations there in 2008. The police arrested him, and he was able to send a photograph of him under arrest out through Twitter. It arrived to Berkeley and to the State Department, and they were able to lobby to get him released from police custody before he was tortured. Now, if you think about this device, this is quite interesting. Why does Twitter matter in this setting? Well, it's like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? If you have your cell phone and you're being arrested and you're trying to phone the one number that you can phone in the time you have, and that person's not home, you're out of luck. With Twitter, it sends it out to your entire feed, right? So here you have multiplied your chances of getting the information out through one single action. So here's an example of utility. There's utility that's negative too. This is an example I ran across last summer in Guatemala, death squad texting, okay? This was something that was received by a human rights activist. Here is the Spanish version on the left and the translation on the right. Stop messing with us and the declassified files from the army will bust your children's asses and then yours. Okay, in the old days when I was a war correspondent, sending a death squad note was a lot of work. You had to get the note, you had to write the note, you had to go to the house, you had to slip it under the door. Somebody might see you, somebody might not. Text messaging makes it so simple. You can send it to multiple recipients. But now we'll go back to the forces of light. Ushahidi, how many of you know about Ushahidi? This is an elegant application. If you've seen Google Maps, that's the platform for it. And the idea is that you get lots and lots of people, or crowdsourcing, to enter in data, usually through cell phone texting, about a disaster. So in this case, it was the Haitian earthquake. And people would send in messages saying, someone's trapped in a house at this address. There's a water main broken on this street. There's a fire on this lot. And this information would be entered into a map that was then made available to relief workers, the Red Cross, the Coast Guard, and et cetera, where they could act on this real-time information to coordinate relief services. So as I said, elegant, practical, and it's something that you will be hearing about quite a lot. It requires a lot of forms of participation and coordination, but it was not only used effectively in Haiti, it was also utilized in the Chilean earthquakes. And there's a lot of suggestion that everybody who's involved in the relief community, the United Nations, the Red Cross, and so on, will be looking at these platforms very, very carefully in the future. Because, for example, in Haiti, there were a lot of cell phones. So you could have vast amounts of data input into these systems. And the fact that you have 10 reports about one incident gives you some level of credibility, right? If 10 people say the water main's broken, the odds are much better that that indeed is the case. And then you add the level of rating systems. So in the same way that you go on Amazon and you say, do you like this review? You can go onto the Ushahidi rating system and it says the water main's broken. Do you think this is likely or unlikely? And you vote. So if you have 50 people saying yes, it's likely, and 2 people saying not, or vice versa, you start to develop standards for utilizing this platform. So the conclusion for all of this is that the internet and digital media are neither good nor bad, better nor worse than old forms of media. It's a catalyst. So it makes whatever is happening anyway happen faster. And if what's going on in your society is people really trying to get involved in relief efforts, it promises to make that happen better and faster. If you're in a society that's focusing on developing its death squad activity, it can make that happen faster too. What do you do in terms of mediating its role in your life? I think that being personally involved and raising children especially to have very strong criteria for when they use it and when they turn it off, and how to notice the dangers of addiction. And when they get pulled into it and it takes them away from their goals. These things are incredibly important, and they're not things that we're doing very well as a culture at the moment. In terms of the democratizing aspect, that is another area that needs a lot of attention. And the current debate about WikiLeaks, I think, is just the beginning of the conversation that's going to have to play out for a long time. The State Department has jumped in with both feet to digital media over the last 2 administrations, actually. And there have been a lot of very positive uses. One that I particularly like is one that I saw in the Dominican Republic, where consular officials will appear in chat rooms where people applying for visas can ask questions instead of standing in line 4 hours or waiting for someone to answer a phone. And so you can speed up these interactions, make them more personal, more efficient. But you can also violate norms. You can also violate confidence, violate trust, and violate privacy. So the problem for all of us is that it's happening so fast that we don't have time to think. It's a great time for the entire culture to take a breath and get ready for the next phase. Thanks very much. Sure.
Take a few questions, if you like.
Yeah, any questions? Oh, yes, sir.
Clarify a little, you commented on what happens when someone reads something on the screen versus in print, whether that's dependent on different content or whether how much of that different
Yeah, that's a great question, and I certainly think the more cluttered environment would have a lot to do with it. But also, the suggestions are that the presence of a backlit screen with the light coming at you and the lower print resolution of letters on the screen than crisp type are factors that tire the eye faster. So right now, one way I try to think about it is that a beautiful page of type is something that's been developed for hundreds of years by people who love reading books. What we have on a computer screen right now is decades old, and it's not developed by people whose primary interest is to enhance the act of reading. So we have a lot of questions that remain to be answered. For example, the Kindle has a gray background. That seems to be helpful in terms of the eye strain that you get compared to the white background, the glare that you get from a computer screen. So that may be a factor, but a lot of people find the gray palette of the Kindle unattractive, including me. But the technology is moving so fast that you may be able to replicate the advantages of the visual quality of the book. One thing that really puzzles me is that the iPad has been developed as another backlit, glaring device. And I have friends who, I don't have one, but my friends say, oh, I could read a book on it. I say, have you? Have you read an entire book on an iPad? Well, no, right? And people don't seem to really want to read long books on iPads. And the devices and the applications, even with magazines that do long-form journalism, is to develop video that is then moving image on the iPad, which takes people's time away from print, right? So one thing that really concerns me is whether those of us who love print and love books can fight to make the reading experience enhanced in the computer environment before the moving image people take over the entire airspace. Yeah?
Would you comment a little more about addiction? And you think people were addicted to watching television when it first came out. And people can go to the gaming table and become addicted. I think chemical addiction is something quite different. But in terms of the addiction, do these rehab services really prevent people from becoming re-addicted? Do they have this recidivism?
Well, they're pretty new. And Gary Small, this neurologist at UCLA, says that there are dopamine cycles in the brain that are similarly triggered by online addiction and chemical forms. So that, there are responses, and it seems to be about this short-term gratification, right, versus delayed gratification. So there's a lot of really interesting research that remains to be done. I will say one thing. I think one thing my students constantly say is that the longer they spend in front of a computer, the more they feel a decline in their quality of attention, right? So you can do good work the first couple of hours, but if you're sitting there for 8 or 9 hours, you start to surf more, you start to lose focus. It kind of makes sense. And yet sometimes at that point it's very hard to break away and to do something else. And it's one thing that's also exacerbated by the solitary nature of the computer, right? People tend to sit there in front of it alone, whereas at least in television, sometimes they watched it with other people, right? And there were automatic breaks like commercials or what have you, where you'd get up and do something else. But people can get locked in a computer posture for days, right? And in fact, there are even various physical responses such as neck reactions and muscle reactions that come from sitting like this for a very long time. So we're not really, I think, very aware of our own actions. And I certainly find that a day can pass when I'm not getting up from the computer. I have to almost force myself to change gears. Is that addiction, or what is it that takes us into that black hole? I don't know yet, but I want to know. And again, I also feel that that's another question about the book. Because when my students write about the difference in the experience, they quite often say, I take the book to one place and then another. I sit on a sofa, I sit in a chair, I change my posture, right? I lie in bed with the book, right? And so this book becomes part of human movement, whereas the way a lot of people use computers at this point is sitting at a desk. Now, will that change as we gravitate towards more mobile platforms? Maybe, I don't know. But I also have kind of an issue with people walking down the street while they're texting in front of traffic, or in a car, where there's a very considerable elevation of accidents through not just texting, but the interactions on cell phones even without texting. We're dividing our attention at our peril in some of these cases. Yes?
You talk a lot about receiving new media. Can you talk a little bit about how creating using media has changed in the brain in particular, how one creates, how one writes, how one solves problems, we can now make our own movies, we create our own web pages, we write books, we write poetry. How does that process differ from sitting with a pad and a piece of paper or a typewriter, and you have to correct and can't cut and paste away?
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about a huge array of activities there, and I would say the one that is least changed is typing. The distance between an electric typewriter and typing on a computer, it's not a huge distance. And for the rest of it, I'm really curious about it. I have talked to my students and said, I know it's a young medium, but I'm not really impressed with the art that is discreetly created for the computer. It's not like I open up one of these websites and say, oh my God, that's so beautiful and moving, right? The way I do in a museum or in front of the older forms of art. And in fact, a lot of what my students show as examples of art online are very, very postmodern, ironic, not really intended to be beautiful. They're meant to mock something. So it may be that if we were in the early stages of painting, the colors wouldn't be very rich because they'd have to learn how to mix colors. Maybe in 10 or 20 years, the artistic creation on this platform will flower in ways I can't imagine yet. But I'm looking hard for it, and so far it's not reaching me. And in fact, to go back a little bit to this other question, there is a movement afoot in many of these circles promoted by Eric Schmidt, CEO of Google, for what is called the technology Sabbath. And the idea is that if you can force yourself not to go online for one day a week, that you can enhance your focus and your mental capacity and have a kind of mental cleanse before you go back to your usual addictive behaviors. And when my students, and in fact when I have done this, the results are quite striking. The mental patterns actually change, and I find that there's kind of a lowering of a kind of anxiety, kind of a more mental, deep breathing that happens. And when I do go back to my online work, I'm somehow refreshed. And my students say it's quite noticeable for them too. I recommend people to try it. Yeah.
Just a comment. I found your comments about how it's harder to learn online, people process information not as well, especially in light of the way everything is going. I mean, there's this movement towards everything is online. Just in the course of this lecture series, we've heard that academic libraries, major academic libraries, there may not be any need for them because everything's going to be online. That the New York Times may not exist as a hard copy in 5 or 10 years. That NJN has not adapted appropriately to online communications, and therefore is going to have trouble existing. It seems as if the total way that things are moving in this electronic media doesn't relate very well to the way we
in my humble opinion, people aren't asking the right questions. And a lot of what's going on now is being led by technologists and engineers and computer scientists who say these are what the devices can do. And what we don't have enough of in the room are the educators and the anthropologists and the psychologists saying this is what we need them to do. And these are our needs. Let us start with those and see the technology that addresses those. So it may be that we'll move towards a print-on-demand society, where if the New York Times is going to run a long, really complicated article about Iraq that citizens need to know, they just say, fine, I'll print it out to read. Or else the devices will improve. That's another possibility. But what we can't afford as a society is to stop reading and comprehending, right? And if you let the technology euphoria drive it too fast, you leave behind the utility. Yeah.
One more question in.
Okay.
There's been an awful lot of publicity about how the U.S. is falling behind other countries in all kinds of educational measures. What's the status of new media usage in the countries that are now ahead of us in all of these areas? Are they as advanced in new media?
Well, based on an
That's why they're doing better than we are in other areas.
Yeah, based on an unscientific sample of my students, I would say that the difference that we have is that if very advanced societies such as Singapore, South Korea, and China, there's a lot more state intentionality regarding the online environment. Singapore's government has jumped into the online environment like nobody's business, but they do it with a lot of state control. And so it's not as entertainment driven, it's not as consumer driven as our environment. And instead, they'll use these crowdsourcing mechanisms to say, everybody indicate where the potholes are in the road system, and then they fix them, right? Now that's really practical, and in terms of the use of that data, sounds good to me, right? China is taking computers on buses out to rural areas to semi-literate farmers and teaching them how to research price transparency for marketing rice crops, and in some of these cases, doubling their income, right? But they're not putting them in the classroom where the students are on Facebook during their studies. That's the difference in our society. And there was a Microsoft information architect who presented it this way a few years ago. I was at the Council on Foreign Relations. He said, societies use digital media differently. And there are the flattened, who are countries that are basically almost media dark, the fit, the ones who use it effectively, and the fat. Guess who he thought we were? You know, and this again is self-indulgent behavior where entertainment and amusement are trumping practical purpose to the point where you forget what your purpose was. And I feel that education has a lot to answer for, and we have to totally rethink how we're using computers in every level of education. I guess one more. This fellow's been very patient. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned the lack of art in computers, but I just wondered if you thought about the computer game industry, which I've spent a lot of time recently among young game designers, and I was startled to learn that it's far bigger now than the movie industry. That many games make more money than any movie makes.
Well, and art is subjective, and all I can say is that when I see these games, I don't have an overwhelming aesthetic response. And maybe other people do, and I'm serious. Maybe there's legitimacy in that, but that doesn't seem to me what they're marketing. So that's my response. Thank you so much.